Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I hope you're enjoying the cold snap, and I hope you guys are ready for the real cold weather coming in tomorrow. My name is Chad Hoeing. I'm a park guide here at Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. And on behalf of the National Park Service, I want to welcome you all to our Veterans Day program here. On the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, the fighting of World War I ended in 1918. Due to the conclusion of the war to end all wars, November 11th became a universally recognized day of celebration. The day was originally declared Armistice Day 8 years after the end of World War I and honored only the veterans of that war. Then, in 1954, after World War II and the Korean War, it was renamed Veterans Day to honor all veterans who served America in war and defended democracy at home and abroad. I would like to recognize any veterans or active duty members of the armed forces today. If that is you, please stand up. Thank you for your service. So I served 6 years in the U.S. Air Force myself. My father served 23 years. As Air Force veterans, we were both occasionally thanked for our service by older veterans prior service. And I would always reply with a "you're welcome" or "thank you for your support" or something along those lines. But my father, he taught me a different way of replying. He would always say, "Thank you for paving the way." Here at Moten Field, the concept of prior veterans preparing the way for the next generation is all the more powerful. As I walk around this sacred site, I feel the sacrifice that each man, woman, spouse, and child provided for the defense of our country. I'd like to take a moment of silence for those who gave the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Thank you. Now is the time not to only honor those who have fought or are fighting for our freedom. It is also time for each of us to take part in protecting it. The defense of freedom is not just for those in the military. Each of us shares that duty and responsibility. So today I ask that you look to those that paved the way as examples of fighting for what you believe in. With that said, I would like to introduce Dr. Daniel Hallman, who just recently retired from the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency, where he served 37 years as the chief of the Organizational History Division. He is also the author of many World War II aviation books, including the Tuskegee Airmen, an illustrated history, the Tuskegee Airmen chronology, a detailed timeline of the Red Tails and other black pilots of World War II. Dr. Hallman.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about Tuskegee Airmen history. And as Chad said, that I was working for the Air Force Historical Research Agency in Maxwell Air Force Base for 37 years. And during that time, I became acquainted with not only the histories of the Tuskegee Airmen units, but the Air Force organizations all over the world. And there's Air Force historical information at the Air Force Historical Research Agency in Maxwell Air Force Base. If you ever have a chance to do research there on your unit or other units you're interested in, not only about World War II, but also World War I and other wars, it's very significant to find sources like that at the Air Force Historical Research Agency. This is the emblem of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, and I used to tell people that's where I work, but I wanted to tell you that that's where I used to work. I retired at the end of September, and I had the opportunity to do a lot of research over the years in the kinds of historical documents that are available. For the Tuskegee Airmen units, we not only have the unit histories, but we also have the mission reports that they developed in World War II. We have orders that awarded them various honors, such as Distinguished Flying Crosses, Aerial Victory Credits, Distinguished Unit Citations. Those kinds of documents are very important in reconstructing what the Tuskegee Airmen did and what the others did who were working with them. The first black military pilot was not a Tuskegee Airman. The first African American military pilot was Eugene Bullard, and he flew for the French Air Service during World War I. We're talking about Armistice Day, Veterans Day. It's appropriate to talk about Eugene Bullard too. Eugene Bullard was like many Americans who flew as volunteers in the French Air Service before the United States got involved in World War I. But when the United States did get involved in World War I, and many of these American volunteer pilots wanted to switch over to the American Air Service, Eugene Bullard naturally wanted to be one of them. He wanted to be in the American Air Service too, but he was not allowed because they did not allow black pilots in the American military during World War I. In fact, they didn't allow black pilots in the American military for over 30 years after the first black pilots entered the Army in 1909. 1909 to 1942, that's over 30 years that the Army did not have any black pilots. The Navy didn't have any black pilots even during World War II. So that was something that had to be overcome. In 1925, the War College, the Army War College, did a report. Sometimes they call it a study, but it wasn't really much of a study. They claimed that black personnel were not suitable to do certain jobs, do certain occupations in the American military, and one of those was flying an aircraft for their country. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that to be wrong. And I want to tell you a little bit about how the Tuskegee Airmen got started, and it also goes to the fact that Franklin D. Roosevelt was running for president in 1940. Now, he had been president 2 terms already. He was running for his 3rd term. It was the first time a presidential candidate was running for a 3rd term. And during the 1940 campaign, he promised that he would make it possible for African Americans, for blacks, to enter the armed forces as pilots. He promised to train them as pilots. He fulfilled his pledge. And in 1941, the first black flying unit was started, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, at Chanute Field, Illinois. It didn't have any pilots left yet, but they would be eventually trained at Tuskegee. And the reason Tuskegee was chosen, part of the reason, was because of the climate. The climate was much better in this part of the country for flying days. There were a lot more good flying days in the South than in, say, a place like Chicago, which was also considered as a place where the black pilots might be trained. Another reason was because civilian black pilots were already being trained successfully at Tuskegee. And another reason was because the Tuskegee Institute leadership was actively lobbying to be the place where the black military pilots would be trained. Eventually, there was a primary flight school set up here at Moton Field, owned by Tuskegee Institute, that would provide the primary flight training under contract with the Army Air Forces. The basic and advanced military flight training after the primary flight training took place at Tuskegee Army Airfield, which was several miles to the northwest of this location. This location is where the primary flight training took place by Tuskegee Institute Flight School in cooperation with the Army Air Forces, which provided the basic and advanced training later on. 1941 was an important year. March of 1941 was when the 99th Pursuit Squadron, later the 99th Fighter Squadron, started. And later that month, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, visited Tuskegee, and she flew with Chief Anderson, Chief Charles A. Anderson, who was providing the civilian pilot training. He was one of the chief pilots, training pilots at the civilian flight school at Kennedy Field, which is another field in the area. And she rode with him over Tuskegee, and when she returned, she was a very vocal advocate of opportunities for African Americans, such as those who would be trained as pilots. She knew they would be trained at Tuskegee because the decision had already been made that they would be trained at Tuskegee. The 99th Pursuit Squadron had already been established, had already been activated. Here at Moton Field, where Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site currently stands, is where the primary flight training took place. And sometimes people are surprised that the primary flight training took place in biplanes on grass. This is the kind of biplane they used, PT-13, PT-17 aircraft. The PT-17, PT-13 aircraft were basically the same aircraft except they had a different engine. They had a few PT-19 aircraft monoplanes that they also used here at Moton Field, but the primary flight training took place from 9 to 10 weeks, and those who graduated from the initial flight training went on to more advanced flight training at Tuskegee Army Airfield, a much larger airfield to the northwest of us. This is an aerial view of that airfield. Northwest of us, Tuskegee Army Airfield, which was an Army Air Forces facility. It was a very large base. It was the only base where the basic and advanced flight training, and at first the transition training for the Tuskegee Airmen military pilots, would take place. They had 3 large double hangars there. And those 3 large double hangars are no longer there. If you went to the site today, you'd just see ruins. You'd see a fenced off area, you'd see trees, you'd see grass, but you wouldn't see much else. But those 3 hangars that were at that field currently exist at airports around the area. One of them is at the Montgomery Airport, one of them is at the Troy Airport, and one of them is at the Clanton Airport. So if you want to see hangars where Tuskegee Airmen pilots actually train, you can see those hangars today at those airports if you look at the right facilities. One other thing I wanted to say about this basic and advanced flight training, they took place in BT-13 aircraft for the basic training and the AT-6 aircraft for those who would be fighter pilots. Some of them also trained to be bomber pilots in twin-engine bombers, B-25s. And to train for the B-25s, they trained in AT-10 aircraft. I don't know how well you can see these pictures, but these are some of the hangars that still exist at Montgomery, at Troy, and at Clanton. And these are the hangars that used to exist at Tuskegee Army Airfield. When Tuskegee Army Airfield closed in 1946, those hangars were disassembled. They were put up almost like erector sets. They were built by the same company, and they were identical in size and shape. And later they were moved to the airports in 1946 or after 1946, so they would still be useful. The most important leader of Tuskegee Army Airfield was Noel Parrish. Noel Parrish was a Southern officer. He was born in Kentucky. He spent some of his time in Texas. But he was the most important leader of Tuskegee Army Airfield and the flight school there, the basic and advanced flight training. He was considered by most of the Tuskegee Airmen who I've spoken with as a very fair officer who was very interested in the success of the Tuskegee Airmen. When he got to Tuskegee Army Airfield, previous leaders of the airfield, who were not there very long, had segregated all the facilities on the base. And one of the things he did was he allowed the desegregation of the facilities at Tuskegee Army Airfield. When he finished leading Tuskegee Army Airfield and helping train the first black pilots in American military history, he went to Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base, and he wrote a thesis that argued for the integration of the armed forces. At that time, the Air Force was just starting. 1947 was when the Air Force started. 1948 was when integration actually happened with Harry Truman, President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981, which mandated the desegregation of the armed forces. And that was partly because of the record of the Tuskegee Airmen. Noel Parrish, by the way, was honored by the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated. Most of the Tuskegee Airmen veterans joined an organization called Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated. And they still meet every year, and they have an award that they give, usually to a Tuskegee Airman, for his accomplishments over the years and his accomplishments over the past year. And that's called the Noel Parrish Award, named after this commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield. There were 44 classes of pilots that went through the training at Tuskegee Army Airfield and at Moton Field. There were 3 phases: primary, basic, and advanced. Each phase lasted from 9 to 10 weeks. And after they finished the training, then they became pilots. They became officers and they got their wings. About 2,000 cadets entered the flight training, and only about 1,000 actually completed the training. So there was a high washout rate. Now sometimes people ask me, how did that compare with the white pilots? It wasn't too different. With the white pilots, it was almost 1 in 2 who also washed out at their training facilities. But the training at Tuskegee was a segregated training, and there were most of the pilots becoming fighter pilots and some of them becoming bomber pilots. The first class had 13, and the 13 that started here at Moton Field, some of them went on to basic training, and then some of those went on to advanced training. Only 5 actually graduated. And one of those 5 was Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was a graduate of West Point. His father was the first black general in the Army. He was a very important man. He became the most important leader of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was in that first class. And just a couple weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, November 1st, 2019, the Air Force Academy renamed their airfield in honor of Tuskegee Airman General Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who eventually became the first black general in the Air Force. He was a Tuskegee Airman. In fact, the first 3 black generals in the Air Force were all Tuskegee Airmen. This is another picture of a class. The classes varied in size. I told you that first class had only 5 who finished the advanced flight training. Later classes were larger than that. But of those 44 classes, there were approximately 1,000 pilots who graduated, finished the flight training and got their wings. 992 to be exact. This is the emblem of the 1st Black Flying Unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, later 99th Fighter Squadron. And that squadron started at Chinook Field, Illinois, as I mentioned before, but it didn't have any pilots at first. It moved to Tuskegee to get its pilots. In March of 1942, the first pilot class graduated. It took a few more months for the squadron to get enough pilots to actually be fully operational. And it took almost a year before it actually deployed. It started March of 1941. It got its pilots in March of 1942, its first pilots. It didn't deploy overseas until the spring of 1943. And when it went overseas, it was flying P-40 aircraft, the same kinds of aircraft that the Flying Tigers flew in the China-Burma-India theater. Now, sometimes people get the wrong idea and they think they had hand-me-down planes from the Flying Tigers. That's not true. They were actually flying the same types of planes, but they weren't flying the same planes that the Flying Tigers flew. They flew P-40s. And the P-40 was a very good aircraft, but it wasn't really useful for shooting down enemy aircraft very much, because by then the Germans had superior aircraft that could shoot down planes better than the P-40. So at first, when the 99th Fighter Squadron went overseas, it went to North Africa, and then it went to Sicily, and then it went to Italy, and it was serving the 12th Air Force. It was flying mostly support missions for units on the ground. 12th Air Force was supporting the ground units and supporting the naval units. And so they didn't have much opportunity to shoot down enemy aircraft. They only shot down 1 enemy aircraft in their first several months of operation. And because the 99th Fighter Squadron was the first black flying unit, it didn't have a black flying fighter group to which to be assigned at first. And so it was by itself. When it went overseas, it was attached to various white fighter groups. And some of those white fighter groups resented having a black fighter unit, fighter squadron, attached to it, because it already had 3 white fighter squadrons. And one of those leaders of the 33rd Fighter Group resisted the 99th Fighter Squadron, tried to get it taken out of combat. In fact, he wrote a report that said that they were not performing well in combat and tried to get them taken out of combat. And the report went all the way up the chain to Washington, D.C. The War Department decided to launch a study to compare the 99th Fighter Squadron with the other P-40 units in the Mediterranean theater, and found that they were flying just as well as the other squadrons. In fact, over Anzio, in January of 1944, they shot down more enemy aircraft in 2 days over Anzio than the other squadrons. So the idea that they weren't flying as well as the white P-40 units was just not true. And Benjamin O. Davis Jr., in the meantime, went from the 99th Fighter Squadron, which he commanded, to the United States to take command of the first black fighter unit, fighter group, the 332nd Fighter Group, which had 3 other squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. Like the other fighter groups of World War II, there were 3 fighter squadrons assigned to 1 fighter group. And that's the way the 332nd Fighter Group started out. The 332nd Fighter Group and its 3 squadrons all started here at Tuskegee. One of those, the 100th Fighter Squadron, is special. Can anybody think of a reason why the 100th Fighter Squadron would be a little bit more significant for us? It's stationed today at Danley Field. And the reason it's there is because it was a Tuskegee Airmen unit that started here in Alabama. It's an Alabama Air National Guard unit. The 100th Fighter Squadron is one of those 3 squadrons in the 332nd Fighter Group. And I wanted to show you, before I get off of the 99th slide, I wanted to ask you, do you see any numerical significance of that emblem of the 99th Fighter Squadron? You see any numerical significance?
9 stars.
Okay, it's got 9 stars.
It has 9 segments.
And 9 segments around, right. They wanted people to know they were the 99th. So they had 9 stars and they had 9 segments around their emblem. One of the things the Air Force Historical Research Agency does is maintain the emblems, the official emblems of Air Force organizations. This is the emblem, this is a P-40 that they were flying, the 99th was flying at first in combat. That's the type of plane that the Flying Tigers also flew. This is the emblem of the 332nd Fighter Group. It doesn't have that numerical significance in it like the 99th, but it's an important emblem as well. Historic emblem. They're still using it for the 332nd, which is today an Air Expeditionary Wing, Air Expeditionary Group. It has a Black Panther spitting fire, and it says Spitfire. And sometimes people ask me, well, did they ever fly Spitfires? Why were they called Spitfire? Well, it's possible that they thought that when they went overseas, they were going to be flying Spitfires, because some of the American fighter units that went overseas, especially to North Africa and later Italy, were flying British Spitfire aircraft, but they never did fly Spitfires. The 332nd Fighter Group, unlike the 99th Fighter Squadron, which was already over there, flew P-39 aircraft. The 332nd Fighter Group didn't actually deploy overseas until the beginning of 1944. And it was flying P-39 aircraft. I don't know how many of you know what a P-39 aircraft looks like, but it has an engine behind the pilot so that the front of the aircraft could be devoted to the cannon and the ammunition for the cannon. It was an aircraft used to destroy targets on the ground. So again, when the 332nd Fighter Group went overseas, like the 99th, it was flying an aircraft mainly for the 12th Air Force to support ground forces. They didn't have much opportunity at first to shoot down enemy aircraft. And that opportunity came later when the 332nd Fighter Group was given in the middle of 1944 the opportunity to escort bombers. It was reassigned from the 12th Air Force to the 15th Air Force. The 15th Air Force flew heavy bombers, 4-engine B-17 and B-24 bombers, and they needed escorts. At the time the 332nd Fighter Group was moved to the 15th Air Force, the 15th Air Force had 21 bomber groups and only 6 fighter groups to escort. So there were a lot more bombers than there were fighters to escort. One of the reasons the 332nd Fighter Group was selected to escort the bombers was because the 99th Fighter Squadron was reassigned to the 332nd Fighter Group, giving it 4 squadrons instead of 3. The 332nd Fighter Group was unique not only because it was the only black fighter group, but also because it was the largest in terms of squadrons. It had 4 squadrons instead of 3 after the 99th Fighter Squadron was assigned to it. And it started its bomber escort duties, escorting planes like this, the B-17, Flying Fortress. Each of the B-17s and B-24s of the 15th Air Force had a crew of approximately 10 men. So it was important to protect the bombers to make sure that those men got back. If 60 bombers were shot down on a mission such as over Schweinfurt, then that would be 600 men lost. Not just the pilots, but the co-pilots, the navigators, the bombardiers, the gunners, all the other personnel aboard the bombers. So it was important to protect the bombers. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was asked to help provide protection for these bombers when the 332nd Fighter Group was reassigned to the 15th Air Force. You might have seen that in the movie Red Tails. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Red Tails. Any of you see that? Okay, the movie isn't strictly accurate. It's not completely accurate, but they do have some important truths in it, like the fact that they were moved over to the 15th Air Force to help provide protection for the 15th Air Force. General Ira Aker of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces wanted the 332nd Fighter Group to be among the fighter groups that protected the bombers. And there were 7 fighter groups altogether in the 15th Air Force. 4 of those groups flew P-51s, and 3 of them flew P-38s. At first, the 332nd Fighter Group, when it switched over to bomber escort duty, it gave up its P-39s for P-47 aircraft, but very soon it switched again to P-51, which was the fastest, most maneuverable, and had the greatest range of all the fighters of the Allied forces. This is an image of a red-tailed P-51, such as those that the Tuskegee Airmen flew in World War II. They got the P-51 in the middle of 1944, during July of 1944. The 332nd Fighter Group and the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadron switched from the P-39 to the P-47 and then the P-51. But the 99th Fighter Squadron switched directly from the P-40 to the P-51. There were a couple of Tuskegee Airmen fighter pilots who actually died in transition training, switching from the older aircraft to the newer aircraft. And one of those was Mac Ross, in the first class of 5 who graduated at Tuskegee Army Airfield, and he was from Selma, Alabama originally. This is an overview of some of the airfields around Ramitelli where the Tuskegee Airmen were stationed. When they were reassigned to the 15th Air Force, they moved to Ramitelli. There were other airfields from other fighter groups in the same vicinity. For example, the 52nd Fighter Group flew yellow-tailed aircraft, and they were a sister group of the 332nd Fighter Group. As I said before, there were 4 P-51 groups and 3 P-38 groups in the 15th Air Force, but they had to escort 22 bomber groups of the 15th Air Force. So there were a lot more bombers than there were fighters. And each bomber group had 4 squadrons. Each fighter group had 3 squadrons except for the 332nd. This is a B-24, which was very similar to a B-17, comparable in size. It had also a crew of about 10 men. The B-24 and the B-17 were two types of bombers the Tuskegee Airmen and the other fighter groups of the 15th Air Force escorted. My own father was a bomber pilot, a B-24 bomber pilot in World War II, but he was in the 8th Air Force. The 8th Air Force was stationed in England. 15th Air Force was stationed in Italy, and that's where the Tuskegee Airmen were. On the Berlin mission, March 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen were able to escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Now, one of the inaccuracies of the Red Tails movie was it makes it look like the other fighter groups failed to show up to escort the bombers to Berlin. Actually, there were 5 fighter groups of the 15th Air Force that did make it all the way to Berlin. But it's a significant mission, not only because it was the longest 15th Air Force mission, and it was to the German capital, but also because 3 Tuskegee Airmen each shot down an ME-262 jet fighter that was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51s that they flew. So it was a very significant accomplishment. One of the Tuskegee Airmen I've got to meet over the years, and I've met many of them. I've been to 8 of the Tuskegee Airmen National Conventions. But one of them was Roscoe Brown. He's no longer with us. But he was one of the 3 Tuskegee Airmen to shoot down an ME-262 fighter. You may wonder about the Berlin mission. It was the only 15th Air Force mission to Berlin. And there were a lot of missions to Berlin. Most of them were flown by the 8th Air Force from England. The reason the 15th Air Force got that job in March 24, 1945 was because the Allies were crossing the Rhine River that day, and the 8th Air Force was helping support the crossing of the Rhine River. So they assigned the mission to the 15th Air Force for a change, from Italy instead of from England. The most famous Tuskegee Airman of all was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., as I said before, was a graduate of West Point. He later went on to become the first black general in the Air Force. His father was the first black general in the Army. He was the commander of the 99th Fighter Squadron. Later, he became commander of the 332nd Fighter Group. And later, he became the commander of the 477th Composite Group. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that composite group, which had been the 477th Bombardment Group, a little bit later. But he's definitely the most famous of the Tuskegee Airmen. And I think his picture is over here. These were designed for the Rose Bowl parade a few years ago. It was a Tuskegee Airman float. And one of them honors Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the other one honors Chief Anderson, Charles A. Anderson, who was the chief civilian pilot here at Moton Field. The Tuskegee Airmen record. They shot down 112 enemy aircraft during World War II, if you count the ones that were shot down by the 99th Fighter Squadron before it was assigned to the 332nd. And then the victories of the 332nd Fighter Group overseas, 112 enemy aircraft. There were no Tuskegee Airmen aces. An ace is somebody who shot down at least 5 enemy aircraft. But there was a reason for that. One reason is because Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. insisted that his fighter pilots stick with the bombers. Some of the other fighter groups weren't as disciplined, and when they would approach, when the bombers were being escorted to a target, enemy fighters would sometimes lure the